Welcome, class, to the second episode of Teaching Tutorial Tuesday, where we try to make a bite-sized video or series or whatever on whatever the specific topic is, trying to dissect, go into a little bit more detail on any specific mechanic in Path of Exile. This is a hard, complicated game. Everyone forgets things once in a while, and it's, at the very least, it's good to have a refresher, or maybe if you don't know this stuff already, this is a good way to start digesting this knowledge. The purpose of this is to be a complement to the other resources out here. I do always recommend using the wiki, using PoEDB, cross-referencing with GGG's official posts. These are just very, very complicated systems. Even if you follow something like physics or math, which are much more concrete, but if you follow even something like that, even some of the most advanced people in those fields do need to do refreshers, do need to reference that material. And no matter what, the best way to consume this stuff is through a multi-resource attack pattern. This is how I really leveled myself up in Path of Exile, using the wiki, really reading through things, exploring, also doing things like PoEDB, etc. And the topic today is damage over time. This is a very often confused topic for a lot of people because it has some complicated, unique things. I mean, everything in Path of Exile is. The goal with this today is to kind of stay at a little bit high level. We will touch on specific types of damage over time, but we're not going to get really, really deep in each one of them. If anything, hopefully this can be a jumping off point for you for exploring a little bit deeper, reading something, like really getting deep into something like Ignite or Poison or anything like that. What is damage over time? It is a damage inflicted continuously over a period of time. Unlike the other three damage sources, damage over time does not hit. This is very, very, very important. Hitting is a very, very specific thing. Damage over time and hits have certain things that are mutually exclusive. This is like really necessary to understand a lot about what's going to go on. There are things like penetration or chance to deal double damage or conditional increased damage, right? Increased damage against chilled enemies. Even if it doesn't explicitly say it in the game itself, which most of these things don't, those certain things, and this is just, you got to study, you got to acquire more knowledge, those things only apply to hits. The way that the damage kind of shakes out is you want to put them in different categories in your head. If you see the word penetrate, or you see double damage, or even triple damage, or anything like that, or if you see something conditional, once you have to memorize it because it doesn't say it in the game. While the damage over time may be a consequence of the hit, after the hit happens, you can basically think of the damage as like two different things that happen. There are additional processing steps like the penetrate, like the double damage, that then will happen only towards the hit. The damage over time will happen separate to that. Might be getting a little confusing this early on, but I want to make that very clear that you want to put what happens in two different buckets in your head right here. All damage over time effects are a kind of debuff. A creature can have multiple applications of these debuffs of the same type, but usually, always be very careful when you see the word usually only the one with the highest damage per second works at any given time. And here's our except for Poison, where all applications stack cumulatively. The main two damage types that I'm going to compare here are Ignite and Poison. I think those are probably the two main archetypes that we can kind of compare. Ignite, right? You could hit them with 4 different ignites. Only the number one ignite that you apply is going to be the one that's doing damage, the one that is the most damage over time. Whereas with Poison will actually accrue more and more stacks. They scale very differently, right? You think about Detonate, Dead, Ignite. That's a very common archetype right now. The way that works and why Detonate, Dead, Ignite is so strong right now is because it is scaled off a gigantic number, which is the corpse life. And so you just want to apply one really big ignite, and then you just step back. And all of the damage that you need to do is being applied. Whereas with Poison, it is the exact literal opposite, where Poison will generally have a shorter duration, but you want to be attacking more and more and more and more and stacking that number as high as possible. It can actually theoretically scale infinitely based on how far you can push the build. So, for example, even if 2 different players apply Ignite to the same target, only the higher damage per second of the 2 ignites will affect the target, at least until the higher fades and leaves the second ignite to become the new highest. In this context, 2 damage over time effects are to be considered the same only if they have the same name. A target may be affected by multiple effects that deal burning damage, such as Righteous Fire, Ignite, and Burning Ground. We ran into this a lot last league. The Searing Exarch monsters, the bats, when you killed them, one of the debuffs that you could, one of the downsides that you could choose on the altar was that the monsters leave, I think it was called like ignited ground or oil charged ground or something. It had a very specific name that was not burning ground. It was called like oily ground or something like that. And so people were taking the Abrath Pantheon that made you immune to burning ground, and they're like, why am I still dying? And then we got a post from GGG and said, oh, that's actually like oily ground. That's not burning ground, even though it looks exactly the same. And so that's one of those circumstances where that's where this plays out, right? So there could be oily ground and burning ground, and both of them could actually stack on top of each other because they have different names. They're not technically the same, burning effect. On kill effects, which we were just talking about, in case of an enemy being killed by damage over time while affected by multiple dot effects, the kill is attributed to the owner of the effect that was inflicted first. Another reason why party play can be a little bit messy, if you have some sort of on kill, like I want to get my life or something on my kill, if the other person applied their poison first, like if someone applied like a 1 damage poison over time and you applied 100 damage ignite over time, even though you might have done all the damage and gotten the kill, if they applied it first, they get the on kill effect, which is another another downside to party play in the game. Damage over time kills from non-character sources like minions or totems will give the kill and any on kill effects to the owner of the totem or minion. This is a limitation of the game and not an intended game mechanic. So that's a thing you can put in your old knowledge quiver there, where normally totems and minions, it doesn't count as you doing it. But if it's a damage over time from a totem or minion, you could count as your on-kill effect. Pretty clever. How do I scale damage over time? What are all the things that go into it? This is a thing that I run into a lot. A lot of people have come into chat asking like, hey, I got these 2 rings. This one says 20% increased damage, and this one says 20% increased chaos damage. If you just had 50% damage or 50% chaos damage, they do the exact same thing. We have our base damage, right? This is how damage scaling works in general, right? We have our base damage that we're scaling, right? And then that gets multiplied by our additive increases, right? So every single increase gets added with each other, right? So this can be chaos damage, this can be overall damage, this can be damage over time. All of these things, like the generic scalars that are just at the high level damage types, these will all add together in the same pool. They all go in the exact same multiplier. And so as long as they all apply to the same type, it's the exact same scalar, and you don't have to, don't really sweat the small things there. There can be specifically poison damage, specifically ignite damage, you can say specifically chaos damage if it's the right type, or just generic damage or damage over time. And these will all apply in the exact same scaling multiplier right there. Natively, modifiers to attack damage, weapon damage, melee damage, and spell damage do not apply to damage over time effects. Those do not apply unless it's specifically stated, and things like Essence Drain, Bane, Contagion, they all have this line here. Modifiers to spell damage also apply to the skill's damage over time effect. So that's a little bit of a transformation right there. Damage conversion does not apply to damage over time. Flat damage from things like added chaos damage support also does not apply to damage over time. Modifiers that increase damage over time will not increase the damage a character deals to himself with things like Blood Rage or Righteous Fire, as this particular effect is considered as part of the buff and not part of the player's damage output. Duration. This is where you end up kind of getting into the math a little bit. Tampering with the duration of a damage over time effect will affect the total amount of damage dealt, but not its damage per second. The exception to this is things like ignited enemies burn faster. You can speed it up. So basically, the duration doesn't affect the damage per second, right? So if you're doing 10 damage per second and the ignite lasts 1 second and you get 100% increased duration, you would still only do 10 damage per second, but it would last 2 seconds long. So you only have to apply it every 2 seconds. But then you can stack it with ignited enemies burn faster, right? So if you made enemies burn 100% faster, it would burn for 2 seconds. So you would start from your 10 base, right? You double the duration to 2 seconds, still 10 damage per second. But if it burns twice as fast, it will go down to 1 second. But then that 20 damage will then compress to 20 damage a second. Generally with damage over time, if you can scale the duration and the speed at the same time, you're able to still keep it going as long as you want, but the DPS will only accelerate by making it apply faster. Faster means the duration will go down, but you basically do increased duration by pushing that up, right? Because otherwise, if you only scale faster, you know, you could make it like a 0.5 second ignite, and then you're like, you have to just reapply it every 0.5 seconds. But if you increase the duration, you can kind of like push that out. So it's not, you don't have to like reapply it as often, if that makes sense. Duration equals max damage and speed equals DPS. Yes, that is a good way to put it, Rizardo. Yep. Duration, you can just think of it as like the total damage multiplier. 10 damage total, right? It's a 1 second ignite. You're doing 10 damage. Double the duration, you're doing 20 damage, but you have to wait twice as long. But then you can make it burn twice as fast. Then it goes down to 1 second. And that you're still doing the same amount of damage, but in a faster period of time. Why does projectile damage not scale poison? Native modifiers to attack damage, something like that. Something that is specific to the type that is not the damage over time, that will only apply to the hit, right? So if it says weapon damage, projectile damage, melee damage, that is only gonna go to the hit. That is not scaling just the raw damage or just the raw damage type that will then turn into the damage over time. There are modifiers that can apply their effects only when a certain condition is met. Modifiers that are conditional on properties, and I was saying this earlier, do not affect damage over time because only hits are able to check someone else's properties. Now that's a weird thing. That's a weird way to write it. That's like kind of written in programmery language, but the way that you can think of it is conditional damage just doesn't apply to the damage over time effect. This says anything like damage against chilled enemies, damage against hindered enemies, anything like that will only go to the hit effect. And it's a little weird. It's a little not clear. Might not make too much sense if you're not a programmer, but that's just like they're going down two different systems. All right, visual clarification by Mark. Anything posted by Mark GGG, he's basically like the core systems designer guy. What he says is basically gospel. Let's see what he says here. This is exactly what I kept doing this. And this is how I was thinking of it, right? Basically just process the base fire damage, right? That means all of these things, specifically, like these are the things that we don't see on the other arrow, right? These things go into the total fire damage that go into fire damage taken from a hit, right? Whereas if it wants to calculate the ignite, it's only checking these things. You just have to memorize the things that are native and the things that aren't. There's not much more to do besides that. Like it might not even be logical from an English perspective. That is Path of Exile. Things that damage, fire damage, burning damage, dot modifiers, turns into ignite damage per second, which then turns into ignite damage taken per second. But these things are two very, very different things. While these two damage instances came off of the same initial hit, these totally bifurcate into two separate things that no longer are related to each other once they turn into the hit and the ignite. So fizz to cold conversion. This is not processed, the hit that then turns into ignite, right? So while there's a fizz to cold conversion and, you know, maybe there's actually less fire damage done, which if conversion mattered, maybe that would change the amount of the ignite. But since all the conversion is only processed as part of the hit, just think of them as two totally separate processes. You can just ignore the fact that that even entirely happens whatsoever. The way that you want to think about this is you have your increased damage and then damage over time multiplier. You can think of it basically like crit multi. If you understand crit multi, it's just an additional multiplier that instead of saying 60% more damage, it would say 160% crit multi. It's basically just a different wording for a specific additive more damage multiplier. So we have our base damage, right? Our base damage going out that then is scaled by all of our increases, right? Increased chaos damage, increased fizz damage, increased whatever, right? If we're doing like a poison, something like that. When it is doing the damage over time, we then have an additive more multiplier here, just a single more multiplier that this is our damage over time multiplier, right? So if we have 150 damage over time multiplier, right? That is just a 50% more damage multiplier. But since it's additive, if we get another 15 damage over time multi, it goes to 165, right? That is just a 65% more damage multiplier. That's the way that you can think of it, kind of additively scaling its own more damage multiplier. That's like the very, very top level basics of what damage over time is, the different pieces that generally go into it. Let's create a little baby character here. What is poison, baby? So, how do we calculate the base damage of the poisoned? We have Viper Strike right here, level 1 Viper Strike. It has 5 to 7 added chaos damage, 6 average added chaos damage when we cast Viper Strike. We also have this baby little glass shank, which adds 6 to 10 physical damage. Let's just say 8. Viper Strike itself has 90% effectiveness of added damage. We have 60% chance to poison on hit. So 6 out of 10 times that we attack, we will actually apply the poison. We will not apply poison 4 out of 10 times. Viper Strike will just do the flat base damage. There will be no damage over time, no poison applied. So, right? Viper Strike, 6 chaos damage, plus the glass shank, 8 physical damage. And the way that poison works, and we'll talk about the details of poison in just a second, it'll do the addition of the physical and chaos damage that you have for the damage over time component. We are going to do a Viper Strike attack. Let's say that it is a success and we apply a poison. It will take 6 chaos damage plus the effectiveness of added damage here, 90%. So it's actually 0.9 times the 8 physical damage of the glass shank. 6 chaos damage plus 8 times 0.9, 7.2, which Rayclast is a brutal, unforgiving place to the point where even the mathematic calculations drop anything that's beneficial to the player. So that's actually only 7 damage. It drops the 0.2, so that is actually only 7 damage, equals a total of 7 plus 6, 13 chaos / fizz damage. We care about the summation of the chaos and fizz damage, which will then apply poison. That is the base damage that applies poison. Any flat added damage will go into that, right? So yeah, if you had a ring that says, 1 to 2 added physical damage to attacks or anything like that, that would get added in. Everything in Path of Exile, Rayclast is a brutal, unforgiving place. The math hates you and will always round down against the player. Hopefully that was a helpful demonstration that shows you like where that base damage comes from. All right, and then let's get into the specifics here. Let's see, damage over time. Let's go to poison. Poison is an ailment that deals chaos damage over time to the affected target. A hit of damage that has a chance to poison is capable of inflicting poison. Unlike Ignite, unlike Shock, unlike Chill, unlike Freeze, any of those ailments, poison is only based on the chance to poison that you get. That's why we use things like Herald of Agony. That's why we go for the chance to, there's the chance to poison support gems, stuff like that. Only physical and chaos damage are able to inflict poison. Poison is a cumulatively stacking debuff. Each application or stack of poison remains present on the target, dealing chaos damage over time until it runs its course. Poison is very unique in the circumstance. There is no limit to the number of poison stacks that a target can have. A single hit, that's why they're using quotes, right? Because this is not like an actual hit that gets calculated. A single hit can apply a maximum of 1 poison stack. Therefore, having more than 100% chance to poison is redundant. You can't like have 1.2 chance to poison. The base damage per second is dealt by a given application of poison equals 30% of the combined physical and chaos damage of the base damage dealt, which applied that particular instance of poison. This is where, as we continue our calculation, poison damage, 0.3, it only does 30%, right? So now this is where we get into like unfortunate rounding down, right? Times 0.3, so the 3.9 rounds down to 3. So it actually turns into 3 damage per second is what's going to happen here. So we're going to hit with a level 1 Viper Strike that has a glass shank, and it will add those up when we do poison. That will add up to 13, and then poison damage itself multiplies that by 0.3, and then that is how much damage per second is going to be done. The following damage modifiers will directly apply to poison. So this is what we were saying before. The generic ones, damage over time, poison damage, physical damage, not local, attack physical damage, just generic physical damage that applies to the physical damage that applies the poison. Minion, trap, mine, totem damage modifiers will affect the damage of the poison applied by those specific types. Double damage from passives or things like Paradoxica do not apply to poison damage. Those only apply to hits. Remember the separation here of the attacker stats. If it says attack damage, double damage, penetrate, you just got to memorize it. Those are things that only apply after the hit happens as part of the hit portion. The poison will apply, but also the hit itself will apply and do, you'll still get your on-hit damage, but the poison itself will just generate this damage over time effect that is a little bit separate. Critical strike multiplier does not affect poison damage unless you have the perfect agony keystone. The damage multiplier for ailments from critical strikes exists independently from the critical strike multiplier used for hits. Base critical strike multiplier is 150. This damage multiplier does not function as 50% more damage, but as 50% damage over time multiplier, which stacks additively with other sources of damage over time multiplier. Blah, 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 blah. This is all just for perfect agony. By default, poison is not a crit-based ailment, but you can turn it into a pseudo crit-based ailment by using perfect agony here. The default base duration of poison is 2 seconds. Viper Strike is unique in that it afflicts poison with a base duration of 4 seconds. So there's a little bit of an exception there. Increasing poison duration results in a longer lasting poison that deals damage at the same rate. So if we go back to our Viper Strike thing here, is we ended up with 3 damage over time, and normally that would only be 2 seconds. But since Viper Strike is so damn cool, it's 3 damage for 4 seconds instead of 2 seconds, for a total of 12 damage for a single Viper Strike. Remember, still only doing 3 damage per second, right? Even by scaling, when you scale that duration up, or if you wanted to scale it down, your damage per second does not change. But you can get faster poisons, which will decrease that duration. It works contrary to the duration, but it will compress that amount of damage. And that is how you can scale your damage over time. We calculated that we're doing 3 damage per second. Since it's Viper Strike, it lasts 4 seconds. Default is 2 seconds. If we had 100% faster poisons over 2 seconds, right? So instead of doing 3 DPS, we do 6 DPS, right? We're doing 12 damage in 2 seconds instead of 12 damage in 4 seconds. It turns increased duration into a more damage multiplier, but it is, it's a more damage multiplier per hit. And with poison, since you're attacking, more and more and more, it is very unique in that regard because you're able to stack more. So it's about how many poison stacks that you can keep simultaneously, right? So you can see that each one of my poisons that I apply with my build is doing 24,000 DPS. I have so much duration that my poison lasts 9 seconds. Each stack will last 9 seconds independently. So we can see that per poison, it is doing 220,000 total damage, right? Because it's just the 240,000 or 24,000 times 9. However, we have to think of how many times I can attack per second. How many times can I attack and raise the number of poison stacks within those 9 seconds before they start falling off? And that's the way that you actually calculate your effective DPS with poison. So the faster I can attack before that first stack of poison falls off, if I can attack 100 more times, I have 100 stacks of poison. So now I'm doing 24,000 times 100 stacks per second. It's not only the duration of the stack itself, it's how fast it's how fast that poison is ticking, and then how many times I can attack and apply as many stacks as possible. They all kind of go with each other. And that's also why temporal chains is so strong for a poison build, because the poison stacks last much, much longer. No, applying a new poison does not reset the timer, Rizardo. Nope. So each stack has its own duration. The max poison stacks right here is basically how many times can I apply a stack of poison per 9 seconds, is what this is saying. Each poison stack is 100% independent with its own duration. Like, one of the easiest way I can show this, right, is I can take off temporal chains. Look at my DPS. Goes from 6 million to 4.9 million. And then if we look at my max poison stacks, it went from 129 to 105. Because if they don't have temporal chains, the poison is only lasting 7.3 seconds instead of 9 seconds per stack, so I can have fewer stacks. The stacks will fall off more quickly, and that is just directly the damage change right there. We started with the most complicated ailment. Let's talk about the more simple one. Ignite is an elemental ailment associated with fire that causes the affected target to take burning damage, aka fire damage over time. A hit of damage that has a chance to ignite is capable of inflicting ignite. As we just talked about with poison, same idea. By default, physical and chaos damage will not poison, but you can scale chance to ignite by, chance to poison by chance to poison gems, stuff like that. Similarly, you can have a chance to ignite. You can get this on the passive tree. You can get this on pieces of gear. Things like on the passive tree, right? If we take a look here, up here, I believe, let's see if I can find it right away. Chance to ignite, right? So even in a non-crit scenario, any fire damage will give you a chance to ignite, kind of ignoring the crit effect there. Critical strikes inherently have a 100% chance to ignite. By default, only fire damage is able to inflict ignite, but especially if you have played an ignite-based elementalist anytime in the past year or so, you know about Shaper Flames that says all damage can ignite. You can ignite with chaos damage or physical damage, but it still is scaling off of that base damage. Resistance modifiers like penetration do not affect the chance to ignite. The base duration of ignite is 4 seconds. The burning damage over time is 90% of the base damage of the hit. Exactly the same, similar calculations to the poison, right? We saw that there was a 30% multiplier for poison damage, whereas with fire damage, it's a 90% off the base damage multiplier. And this is before the increased and more multipliers, resistance calculations, all that type of stuff. Therefore, over the base duration, the target will take 360% of the base damage dealt, right? 90% of the base damage over 4 seconds, right? So if you're doing 10 damage on the hit, it's actually 9 damage times 4. You'll do 36 total fire damage over those 4 seconds. This is ignoring any increase, more, or resistances or anything like that. Those will also scale that damage as when the damage is taken. Increasing the duration of the ignite, either via temporal chains or the increased ignite duration modifier, causes the ignite to deal the same damage per second. This is what I was trying to say a little second ago, is that like temporal chains only affects your damage per second with poison because you're able to apply more stacks. Whereas with ignite, you can only have 1 stack of ignite. So just making it last longer, you will do more total damage for that single ignite, but the damage per second is exactly the same. It just lasts longer. Linking a skill that applies an ignite with increased duration support will not increase the duration of the ignite. That's a good thing to be aware of. The minimum effective duration of an ignite is 0.3 seconds. If an applicable ignite has a lower duration, it does not apply. As of 3.13, that's good to know. So, if you want to just like stack a really, really fast ignite, if you go too fast, it actually won't ignite at all. Separate applications of ignite do not stack cumulatively. So each ignite effect remains present on the target until it runs its course, but only the one with the highest damage per second will cause damage at all. An exception to ignite stacking does exist. Ember Wake allows you to stack 2 ignites. As an ailment, modifiers to attack, spell, melee, and range damage do not apply to ignite. As we said before, this is just the same as anything generic for damage over time. And then the following modifiers apply damage over time for ignite. We went over this many, many times. Double damage does not affect it. Crit strike multi does not affect ignite damage unless the player has perfect agony. I don't know if I've ever seen a perfect agony ignite build. That'd be interesting. That is the way that ignite works. Basically the same as poison, except you can only apply 1 of them, and it is an effect of a crit. I know a ton of stuff here is just very complicated. It's just a lot to always take in. It's one of those things where really the best way, as with everything in Path of Exile, you just got to interact with it, build around it, feel it, and just get that knowledge in your brain. As with anything sufficiently complex, you will never always have it all perfectly memorized. You will always periodically have to go back, refresh your knowledge, kind of refresh things up. Hopefully, just starting to get the idea of what's an exception. Like what is the thing that goes into your damage over time? What are the ways that you want to start scaling it? Think about the pitfalls of like just knowing that, hey, this says attack damage, this says projectile damage, knowing that that's not good for your damage over time build. And you can look specifically at the type of damage that you're doing and now have a better idea of how to scale it. All right, that's it for me today. Thank you so much for watching. As always, gigantic thank you to all of the subscribers and especially all of the patrons. Cannot thank you enough for supporting me and helping me make this content possible. Definitely let me know what other topics you would like me to tackle in the next Teaching Tutorial Tuesday. And yeah, we'll keep them coming. I'm gonna go get ready for the stream and I'll see y'all tomorrow. Goodbye.
Meow, 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 meow. meow, 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 meow.